The following story is a translated and adapted conversation, recounting supernatural experiences from around the world. This content is intended for entertainment purposes only. Listen with an open mind and enjoy the thrill of the unknown. The content in this video is purely for entertainment. Viewer discretion is advised. If you are easily frightened, be prepared some stories might just send chills down your spine. If you're ready, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and immerse yourself in the world of the unexplained.
In July 1916, the Battle of the Somme was a slaughterhouse. A sprawling front in northern France, where British and French forces clashed with German troops in a grinding war of attrition. The trenches' muddy, claustrophobic channels carved into the earth were a labyrinth of death, littered with the bodies of soldiers and the wreckage of hope. Into this nightmare stepped Thomas Reed, a 42-year-old British journalist working for the Manchester Guardian, known for his measured, poignant dispatches from the Boer War and Balkan conflicts. Thomas had a knack for capturing the resilience of soldiers under fire, giving voice to their courage and despair. Thomas's mission wasn't just professional duty. In February 1916, his only son, Edward, a 19-year-old private, had been killed at Verdun, his body lost to a German artillery barrage. The loss shattered Thomas, leaving him with a gnawing guilt for encouraging Edward's enlistment, believing the war would forge him into a man. Journalism became Thomas's way to honor his son, to seek stories of soldierly grit and ensure Edward's sacrifice wasn't forgotten. Armed with a leather notebook, a fountain pen, and a Kodak vest pocket camera, Thomas embedded with British troops in the Somme, ignoring warnings that the trenches were a grave for the living. The journey to the Somme was a descent into desolation. Thomas traveled by train from London to Amiens, then joined a supply convoy rattling through shell-pocked roads to the front. The air was damp with summer rain, thick with the stench of mud and decay. British Tommies trudged alongside, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow from months of shelling. "The Somme's a butcher's shop," one corporal muttered. "You don't come back whole." Thomas nodded, scribbling the quote, but the words settled in his chest like a stone. His assignment was to spend 6 days with the 8th Battalion of the East Surrey Regiment, reporting on their push against German lines near Mummets. The trenches were the heart of the war squalid, waterlogged ditches where men lived and died amidst mud, rats, and artillery. Thomas's goal was to interview soldiers, photograph the front, and capture the human spirit amid the carnage, hoping to find echoes of Edward's courage. The convoy dropped him at a staging area, muddy encampment of tents and barbed wire, buzzing with the clatter of rifles and the groans of the wounded. The air was heavy with cordite, the horizon lit by the flash of shells. That first night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The camp roared artillery shouts, the wail of a distant bugle. He sat in his tent, reviewing his plan: join the battalion, enter the trenches, and document the soldiers' lives. The trenches intrigued him, a raw, unfiltered view of war, but they also unnerved him. Their darkness, a reminder of Edward's letters describing Verdun's horrors. "This is for you, lad," he whispered, clutching his notebook, but a quiet dread settled in his gut, a premonition he dismissed as grief. The first 2 days were a grueling immersion in the Somme's misery. Thomas trudged through the trenches with the 8th Battalion, led by Captain Harold Bates, a weary officer with a permanent frown. The trenches were a muddy tomb, their walls collapsing under rain, their floors slick with water and blood. Thomas interviewed Tommy's young privates, grizzled sergeants, their stories a mix of defiance and despair. He photographed the scene, sandbags riddled with bullet holes, a soldier's helmet half buried in mud, a crucifix dangling from a splintered beam. Each image felt heavy, a reminder of Edward, of his unrecovered body lost in similar trenches. On the second day, the battalion reached a forward trench near Mummet's Wood, a scarred landscape of craters and barbed wire. A local French villager, evacuated but lingering near the lines, warned Thomas through a translator about a death bell ringing before massacres. "It calls the dead," the old man said, his voice trembling. "You hear it, you don't come back." He described spectral soldiers seen in the trenches, their faces, skulls, their bells tolling for the living. Thomas noted the story, dismissing it as folklore born of war's trauma, but the man's words clung to him, stirring unease. The Tommies, overhearing, laughed nervously, but their eyes darted to the trench walls. That afternoon, the battalion endured a German barrage, shells screaming overhead, shaking the earth. Thomas's camera captured the chaos soldiers, huddling, mud spraying, a private praying aloud. His notebook pages smudged with red, though his hands were clean, the ink inexplicably wet. He shook it off, blaming the damp, but the trench felt different, colder, heavier, as if it was watching. The soldiers grew quieter, their banter fading, and Captain Bates's frown deepened. Thomas felt Edward's absence keenly, a pang of guilt for his son's death, and the trench's silence seemed to mock him. The forward trench was a claustrophobic hell, its walls slick with mud, its air rank with decay and cordite. Thomas moved cautiously, his boots sinking into the mire, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. His camera clicked, capturing the trench's stark reality. A rat gnawing a discarded ration, a soldier's letter trampled in the mud, a bayonet rusted with blood. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the drip of water and the distant boom of shells. The walls seemed to pulse, the air growing colder, as if the trench was alive. Thomas's fountain pen scratched in his notebook, recording a private's tale of lost comrades, but the ink bled red, smudging the pages. He frowned, checking his hands, but they were clean. His flashlight flickered, its beam weakening, and the air grew heavier, the stench sharper, like rotting flesh. He interviewed a young Lance Corporal, Tommy Ellis, who admitted to hearing odd noises in the trench bell's footsteps. "Like the dead are restless," Ellis said, his voice low. Thomas's recorder was running, but when he checked it, the tape captured a faint bell toll, its sound unnatural, coming from no clear direction. His skin prickled, a sense of being watched pressing against him. The trench twisted, its passages narrowing, the darkness deeper. Thomas thought of the villager's warning, of the death bell, and felt a chill, his heart quickening. Bates led the way, his flashlight sweeping for snipers, but the soldiers were tense, their eyes darting to the walls. The trench felt alive, its mud a living thing, its shadows shifting just beyond Thomas's beam. He photographed a collapsed dugout, but his camera's display showed smudges vague, human-like shapes that vanished when he looked up. He tried to rationalize it, a glitch, mud on the lens, but the bell toll returned, now a soft chime coming from the earth. At dusk, the battalion settled in the trench, preparing for a night under shell fire. Thomas sat in a shallow alcove, his flashlight trembling, his notebook open. The bell toll grew clearer, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to rise from the ground, vibrating through the mud. His pulse raced, his recorder running, capturing the sound, but when he checked it, the tape was distorted, the toll layered with moans. The air plunged to freezing, his breath fogging, the trench's stench sharper, like an open grave. He raised his camera, snapping photos, but the toll became louder, a relentless knell that shook the trench walls. Thomas's flashlight flickered, its beam dimming, and the shadows seemed to move, forming shapes in the corners. He reviewed his camera shots, and his stomach twisted. In one photo, a figure stood in the trench, a soldier, his face a skull, clutching a rusted bell, its surface etched with scratches. The soldier's form was faint, fraying like smoke, but his presence was unmistakable, a weight that chilled Thomas's blood. Thomas called Bates, who frowned, seeing nothing in the photo. "Trench fever," he muttered, but his voice was tense. Ellis, nearby, paled, swearing he'd heard the bell too. The other soldiers shifted uneasily, their rifles gripped tighter. The toll came again, louder, a dirge that seemed to call the dead. Thomas thought of Edward, of Verdun's trenches, and felt a surge of guilt, a fear that he'd trespassed into a tomb. The trench's walls seemed to close in, the mud softer, as if ready to swallow him. Thomas pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and compulsion, his flashlight trembling. The trench was a muddy tomb, its air icy, almost solid. His teeth chattered, his fingers numb. The bell toll grew deafening, a grinding knell that vibrated through the earth, shaking the walls. Thomas's mind flooded with images: soldiers, torn by shrapnel, trenches collapsing. Edward's face among the dead, his eyes accusing. The visions weren't his, but they felt real, as if the trench was forcing him to see its pain. He raised his camera, snapping photos, but the toll became a chorus. Voices moaning in English. French, German soldiers, all screaming, "Stay with us." Then he saw him, the soldier from the photo, standing at the trench's end, his face a skull, its bone cracked and yellowed, his eyes black pits that swallowed the light. He rang a rusted bell, its surface pulsing with scratches that bled red. The moan came from him, a sound that wasn't just grief, but rage, a demand for remembrance that pierced Thomas's soul. Thomas's legs buckled, and he fell, his camera slipping from his grip. The skull-faced soldiers pits-bored into him, and Thomas felt a jolt, as if his soul was being peeled open, his guilt for Edward's death, his failure to save him, his own survival while his son perished. The moan became a dirge, a cacophony of voices: Tarmies, poilus, Lanzera, accusing him. "You let us die." The trench darkened, the mud curling around Thomas, its surface writhing like worms. His flashlight died, plunging him into near darkness. The soldiers formed the only light, a sickly glow that burned his eyes. More figures emerged, spectral soldiers, their bodies torn by shrapnel, crawling from the mud, their hands reaching, cold and skeletal, clawing at Thomas's skin. The ground softened, pulling at his boots, and the bell tolled faster, each ring a stab of pain in Thomas's skull. The spectres moaned, "Stay," their voices a grinding dirge that drowned his thoughts. The trench pulsed, its walls rippling like flesh, the mud rising to his knees. Thomas's scream caught in his throat, his body paralyzed by a terror he'd never known, not in Pretoria, not in Salonika, not anywhere. The skull-faced soldier glided forward, his bell tolling, his pits inches from Thomas's face. Thomas felt hands icy, sharp gripping his chest, dragging him down. Ellis's shout broke the spell, his voice raw. "Read, move." Bates grabbed Thomas's arm, his face pale, his frown gone. The soldiers scrambled, their rifles useless against the spectres. Thomas stumbled to his feet, grabbing his camera, and ran, the dirge chasing him through the trench. The mud lunged, its surface snagging at his legs, as if the trench was alive. They burst into a reserve trench, collapsing in the mud. The bell fading, but the silence worse heavy, alive, watching. Dawn broke over the Somme, pale and cold, the trenches shrouded in mist. The battalion sat in stunned silence, their eyes avoiding Thomas's. Betts ordered an immediate retreat to the staging area, the mission abandoned. Thomas checked his camera, but the photos were corrupted streaks of grey, shadowy figures in every frame, and one clear image, the skull-faced soldier, his pits staring, his bell glowing, surrounded by crawling spectres. He deleted it, his hands trembling, but the image was seared into his mind, a wound that wouldn't heal. His skin bore claw-like scratches, red and raw, though his clothes were intact. As they marched back, the trenches loomed, their walls like gaping mouths. Thomas heard the bell one last time, faint but clear, coming from the earth. He didn't look back, afraid of what he'd see. At the staging area, a lorry evased them to Amiens, the soldiers silent, their faces a blur. Ellis, sitting beside Thomas, noticed his scratches. "You heard it," he said, "not a question." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. "It doesn't leave," Ellis murmured, echoing the villagers' warning. Back in Manchester, Thomas tried to move on. He filed a brief dispatch with the Manchester Guardian, describing the Somme's trenches, but omitting the soldier. The words felt empty, inadequate against the horror he'd seen. The trench clung to him, a shadow that darkened his days. He couldn't sleep without hearing the bell, couldn't hold his pen without feeling those cold hands. His dreams were haunted by the skull-faced soldier, by the spectres, by Edward's face, accusing him of failure. Thomas quit journalism, his pride in his work shattered by the weight of the Somme. The camera from the trench sat in a locked drawer, its lens covered, as if to keep something trapped. Sometimes, at night, he heard bells deep tolling, coming from his home's corners. He never looked afraid of what he'd see, but the soldiers' pits lingered in his mind, a stain that wouldn't fade. A year later, a colleague found a single print from Thomas's Somme trip, slipped into a folder of unrelated photos. It showed the trench, empty except for a faint, blurry soldier, his skull face staring, his bell glowing in the dark. The print was streaked with red, as if mud had seeped through the paper. Thomas burned it, his hands trembling, but the toll lingered, a reminder that some trenches never let go.